The jungle was supposed to be the great equalizer. For the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, the dense, rotting vegetation of the South Pacific and Southeast Asia was not just terrain, it was a fortress, a weapon that they believed they had mastered better than anyone else on Earth. The doctrine was simple and arrogant in its certainty. Heavy armor could not operate here. The mud was too deep, the inclines too steep, the trees too thick, and the humidity too corrosive. In their strategic calculations, the tank was a creature of the open Russian steppes or the flat deserts of North Africa. Here, in the green twilight of New Guinea or the bamboo ridges of Burma, the war would be fought by men, infantrymen who could slip through the undergrowth like ghosts, carrying everything they needed on their backs. They believed that the jungle rendered the industrial might of the Allies irrelevant, forcing the enemy to fight man to man, a fight the Japanese soldier was culturally and spiritually prepared to win. But that belief was a fatal miscalculation, one that would be shattered not by strategy meetings in Tokyo, but by the terrifying sound of engines grinding through the chaotic noise of the rainforest. The realization came slowly at first, then with devastating speed. In the early campaigns, like the Fall of Malaya, the Japanese themselves had used bicycles and light tanks to shock the British, moving faster than expected down paved roads. But as the war ground on and the Americans and Australians pushed back into the deep bush, the Japanese high command remained convinced that the true trackless jungle was impassable to the M4 Sherman or the M3 Lee. They were wrong. They had underestimated the sheer brute force of American engineering and the desperation of Allied infantry who refused to die against coconut log bunkers without heavy support. Imagine the perspective of a Japanese defender dug into a spider hole on the island of Luzon or along the Kokoda Track. You have spent weeks fortifying a position that is invisible from 5 feet away. You have interlocking fields of fire, machine guns positioned to cut down anyone foolish enough to walk up the trail, and mortars dialed in on the choke points. You are hungry, perhaps suffering from malaria, but you are confident. Then the ground begins to vibrate. It isn't the rhythmic thud of artillery, but a constant, mechanical churning that seems to be tearing the earth apart. Trees, ancient and thick, begin to sway and crack. The canopy, which usually blocks out the sun, is suddenly torn open, and then it emerges. A 30-ton beast of olive-drab steel, crushing the undergrowth, snapping bamboo like dried twigs, and rolling directly over the obstacles that were supposed to stop an army. For the Japanese infantrymen, this was the moment the war shifted from a contest of martial skill to a slaughter. They were totally unprepared for armored warfare in close quarters. Their anti-tank weapons were woefully inadequate. The standard 37mm anti-tank gun, which could barely scratch a Sherman's frontal armor, was heavy to move through the mud and difficult to aim in the claustrophobic confines of the jungle. When the tanks appeared, often just 20 or 30 yards away, the Japanese soldiers realized with horror that their rifles and machine guns were useless. The bullets sparked harmlessly off the hulls. The terrifying psychological impact of seeing a tank in a place where God seemingly never intended a tank to be cannot be overstated. It was like seeing a battleship sail down a river. The Allied adaptation was a marvel of logistics and grit. In places like Burma, British and Indian troops faced Japanese positions on steep, terraced hillsides, the tennis court battle at Kohima being a prime example. The gradients were so steep that mules struggled to climb them, yet the Allies winched M3 Lee tanks up the slopes, dragging them into positions where they could fire point blank into the Japanese bunkers. The M3 Lee was an ugly, tall, obsolete tank by European standards, but in the jungle, its ability to carry a 75mm gun in the hull and a 37mm gun in the turret made it a dual-threat bunker buster. For the Japanese trapped in their earthworks, there was no escape. The tank would simply roll up to the bunker's firing slit and blast it into oblivion. Deprived of effective long-range anti-tank weaponry, the Japanese infantry resorted to tactics that were as brave as they were suicidal. This was the birth of the human bullet approach to anti-tank warfare. Infantrymen were issued lunge mines, essentially a shaped charge on the end of a bamboo stick. The tactic required a soldier to break cover, sprint through a hail of machine gun fire, and ram the charge manually against the side of the tank, killing himself instantly in the hope of disabling the machine. Others carried satchel charges or magnetic mines, waiting in their spider holes for a tank to roll right over them, hoping to attach the explosive to the thinner belly armor. It was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Allied tank crews learned to never operate alone. They covered their holes with sandbags, concrete, and even logs to prevent the magnetic mines from sticking. They sprayed the trees with canister shot and machine gun fire, hosing down the vegetation to kill the tank hunters before they could get close. The sensory experience of these encounters was a unique kind of hell. In the open desert, a tank battle is a game of range and maneuvering. In the jungle, it was a knife fight in a phone booth. The tank crews were blind, buttoned up inside a sweating steel box, relying on the infantry walking alongside them to spot targets. For the Japanese, the terror was the noise and the flamethrowers. The introduction of the Zippo tanks, Shermans or Stuarts equipped with flamethrowers instead of or in addition to their main guns, marked the end of the Japanese defensive doctrine. A bunker complex that could hold out for weeks against infantry assaults could be neutralized in seconds by a jet of liquid fire. The flame didn't just burn, it sucked the oxygen out of the caves and tunnels. The psychological devastation of watching a position consumed by fire, delivered by a machine that could not be stopped, broke the spirit of units that had previously fought to the death. The terrain itself, which the Japanese counted on as an ally, turned against them. The noise of the tank engines was amplified by the canopy, making it impossible to tell which direction the armor was coming from until it was too late. The heavy tracks churned the mud into a soup that slowed down the retreating Japanese infantry, while the tanks, often equipped with wider tracks or duckbill extenders, kept moving. The Allies also utilized the sheer weight of the tanks to clear paths. Where a Japanese patrol might take hours to hack through a mile of vines with machetes, a column of tanks created a highway. They bulldozed paths for the infantry to follow, bringing the entire weight of the American logistical tail right to the front lines. The isolation that was the Japanese defenders' greatest strength was erased. By the time of the Philippines campaign in 1945, the Japanese army was facing a mechanized onslaught they could not comprehend. In the Battle of Luzon, American tank columns moved with a speed that defied the geography. They smashed through bamboo thickets and crossed rice paddies that were supposed to be tank traps. The Japanese 14th Area Army, commanded by General Yamashita, found their defensive lines pierced and bypassed. They had prepared for a static war of attrition, but they were given a war of movement. The tanks brought the heavy firepower of artillery right to the infantryman's face. There was no safe distance. If you could see the tank, it could kill you. If you hid from the tank, the infantry following it would find you. If you stayed in your bunker, the flamethrower would burn you out. This technological mismatch revealed a fundamental flaw in the Imperial Japanese worldview. They had prioritized the spiritual strength of the individual soldier over the material reality of modern war. They believed that fighting spirit could overcome steel, but in the jungle, against a Sherman tank that was impervious to rifle fire and bayonet charges, spirit meant nothing. A soldier with a lunge mine might destroy one tank at the cost of his life, but there were always more tanks behind it. The American factories were churning out armor faster than the Japanese could train men to die destroying them. The jungle, once the domain of the silence and the sniper, had become an industrial worksite of destruction. The trees were shattered, the earth was churned, and the silence was replaced by the roar of Ford and Chrysler engines. The Japanese soldier, starving and isolated, watched from the tree line as the 20th century rolled over his positions. He had been told the jungle would protect him, that the white man's machines would bog down and fail in the humidity. Instead, the machines adapted. The welders in Detroit and the mechanics in the field ensured that the tanks kept rolling. The Japanese infantryman didn't lose because he lacked courage. He lost because he was fighting a war of flesh against a war of gears. He stood in the path of an inevitability, holding a bolt-action rifle against a 30-ton reality that refused to acknowledge the rules of the jungle.